Hey everybody, this is Perch. I've done this video before, but I'll do it again. Uh, this uh, this video is about, it kind of always stems when I talk about numbers, and it's because some of the larger channels have tried to basically create a gotcha in the form of, yeah, there's orders going into of comics, and the orders aren't terribly good in a lot of cases, but it's even worse than that. The numbers are even worse than the bad numbers you think they are because a lot of those comics are not getting sold. And then people will usually share a photo of like a dollar bin or something, and they've got a bunch of America Chavez number ones in there, or Civil War II number three, or whatever it happens to be. They've got some comics in there that seem to validate this idea that comics are being purchased by the comic shop, but they're not actually being bought and taken home by human beings, and therefore the sales, however bad people say they are actually worse than bad. They're so bad that the comics aren't even going home. And this has been a kind of a gotcha for a while of a way to say, and the other way this argument often comes up is connected when a creator like, say, Tom Taylor will start talking about how the Superman Kal-El book is one of the best-selling books of all time. Now, obviously, that is he didn't say that, but he's exaggerated heavily on the sales of the book. Why he does this? Well, mainly because he gets a reaction. I mean, let's be honest. That's what typically occurs. Is he says that a bunch of people kind of yell and scream for a while, and then he gets to chuckle and go, "Ha ha! I triggered you guys," and then that's the entertainment that you get on Thursday instead of, say, writing comics. But anyway, the reality though is that it's more complicated than this, and the big myth here is that comic shops are consistently month in, month out ordering hundreds of comics they don't need. So to kind of explain kind of why this isn't the big, gotcha that you think it is, it's important to look at kind of how the direct markets evolved and the different types of comic sales. So once upon a time, there was the newsstand. And the newsstand is you going into a grocery store or a gas station, and there'd be comics there. And on the newsstand, like any periodical, like magazines and other things, they offered what's called returnability. And what that meant basically was that the gas station orders 100 copies of a comic, and basically they have to return what they don't sell. So in a month's time, or it's usually a little bit longer than that, they have to do the work of going to the shelves, taking the old issues off, and in ripping off the cover of them to prove that they're not they're actually legitimately unsellable. So why do they do that? Well, when they say return, you didn't have to return the entire comic. Otherwise, you're inflicting a lot of shipping costs on the newsstand. So what you'd do is you'd rip that cover off, proving that the comic is quote unquote unsellable now. Now, several shops would just proceed to give the comics away to flea markets and stuff. If you've ever gone and you've seen a bunch of comics with no cover, that's what's going on. You'd see very few of those today. But back in the 80s, you'd see this quite often in, again, flea markets, garage sales. You'd see these boxes of comics with no cover. Because typically you take the comic, and what you're supposed to do is rip off the cover and then take the comic, though it's left of it, and throw it in the garbage. Sometimes shops would do that. Sometimes they'd put it in a little box near the front and say, take what you want. So at any rate, the returnability number was actually a much better and accurate way of telling what was going home, what was getting into hands of actual comic readers, because you might say, Marvel, and there's charts that would show this, would show like 300,000 copies of Uncanny X-Men were bought by the newsstand, by all the different markets. And then of those 300,000, it would say, returned 75,000. And so you would go, okay, well, they returned 75,000. That meant the actual comics that went home, went to somebody's house that paid for it, was 225,000. 300,000 minus 75. That's the way it worked. This system was really good in terms of saying, generally speaking, the comics that went home this way could be told through the returnability numbers. Very easy to track. Now, granted, and I'll throw this in there because it is one little piece, is when a comic like Uncanny, or not Uncanny, the Jim Lee, Chris Claremont X-Men #1, the one that sold over 6 million copies. Now, the reality is a lot of those did go home. However, they, because of variant copies and the speculator boom and everything, people were buying 20 copies, 30 copies. Obviously, they're not reading all of those copies. They're putting 29 in a box and reading one, sometimes reading zero. But it's just worth noting that sometimes when people say, yeah, but were these comics actually read by readers? You do have to take into effect that some of these comics are bought by collectors. And so they're being read by no one. And this is especially true of kind of these, Death of Superman, the X-Men, the New Mutants issues where people were buying multiple copies, for sure. Now, what happened in the direct market is the direct market basically said, hey, we, the publisher Marvel, are going to sell you the comic, and we're going to give you a much bigger margin. Instead of, less than 10%, we're going to give you 60%. However, you've got to buy this comic from us. There is no returnability. So if you order 300,000 copies, you're on the hook for 300,000 copies. And don't come crying to us if you only sell 5 copies. That was your choice. The publisher makes their money, regardless. The comic does not need to go home. Once a comic shop has purchased that comic, it's money into the publisher's hands. The publisher is done. So the publisher doesn't look at an individual issue and say, hey, did people buy this comic or not? They're just interested in that initial sale. Can we get the retailer to basically buy as many copies as we can? And that's why you see variant schemes. That's why you see so many relaunches, because a lot of retailers will order higher on #1s. That's the game that's being played there. Now, why I say it's not a gotcha, because I haven't answered the question of, well, what about those giant stacks at retailers? It's this. Our comic shop, a retailer, does not stay in business by ordering tons of comics they can't sell. It doesn't happen. That's why the comic publishers do look at the month-by-month trends rather than the individual sales. It's kind of that you may have fooled me for 1 or 2 months, but I'm not going to continue to order high. It's one reason why you look at the sales analysis chart. Sometimes you'll see issue 1 and issue 2, the sales number's quite high, but then you see this steep drop-off with issue 3. Because the retailer has to order these comics long before they get them. So right now, it's January. We saw the solicitations to the retailer for March, and we're about to see April. What it means is in the next 2 to 3 weeks, comic shops are going to be ordering April's comics. And if the comic just began, if there is a brand new #1 issue in February and a #2 issue in March and a #3 issue in April, that means the retailer is ordering blind. Issue 3. They don't yet know whether the February or the March issues are going to sell. Now, by the way, there's final order cutoff date, and there's ability to change orders, and these also things happen. But the point I'm trying to make here is that comic shops will guess at what a comic will do. But within 2 months, they know how that comic is done, and they will adjust their orders accordingly. It is possible to trick a retailer for 2 months. It's not possible to trick a retailer 3 months. So in terms of those big stacks there, if some retailer has, a Squirrel Girl #41, and they've ordered 100 copies of it and sold 2, you can't blame the publisher in that case. You have to blame the retailer. The retailer is a moron. The retailer knows how many copies this is going to sell, and they will pull back. So why I say it's not a gotcha is that it doesn't last. There's not a scenario where, 5 months into Tom Taylor's Superboy run, people, retailers are still ordering huge numbers of it, while readers aren't buying any of it. It would have adjusted. It's a fair point for issue 1, issue 2, a couple issues into a run, but it falls apart when you start looking beyond that, because the retailers will adjust. No retailer has the money to just order huge every month regardless of what sells. The publisher will put out whatever they want because they're getting their money up front, but they also have to watch out that they don't keep putting out a comic that nobody buys. So that's what has gone on. That's how you should read the numbers. It basically means that, once upon a time when it was a newsstand with returnability, it was a much more accurate indicator of what people were actually buying and taking home. In the days of direct market, it's far more murky. We don't know what was taken home because there's no returnability. The comic shops are, in theory, sitting on inventory. However, they're not sitting on a ton of inventory. No comic shop is going to month after month over order. So therefore, if you're saying, oh yeah, well, this Tom King Batman comic sold 80,000 copies, well, yeah, but how many of those actually went home? Well, most of them. The vast majority of them actually went home. Comic shops will certainly order a little bit of extra stock in order to have something to kind of fill the shelves or in back issue bins and other things. But when you see those comics in the dollar bin or the quarter bin, what you'll notice is one of two things. Either it's a number one or a number two issue, and the retailer ordered big on it and it didn't sell. In particular, you will see this for events. There's going to be lots and lots of comics in the AXE Avengers X-Men Eternals miniseries in those quarter bins because retailers were big, hoping the event would pop. They usually do. It didn't this time. So you're going to see a lot of comics in that state. However, at the same time, the other factor that comes into play is that comic shops will order large in order to pick up a variant. So what Marvel or DC or these companies will do is say, we'll give you this special exclusive variant, but you got to order 20 copies of the comic in order to get it. The retailer knows that there's a whale or a high buyer in their shop that will basically, will pay $20 for that comic. And so the retailer does some quick math and goes, well, I'm going to go ahead and order 20 copies, even though I'm only selling 2, because the variant cover I'm going to get will, it will make up the money. So I'm not losing money. And that's how you also see comics in the quarter bin. In general, when you see comics in the quarter bin, you will notice they're almost all number ones or number twos. They're often tied to events. They're tied to things where it was clearly early in the run. The retailer was getting a variant or they were just ordering higher than normal because they thought the comic would do better. You will rarely see issue 17, issue 40, issue 61. You'll rarely see those kinds of issues in the quarter bin because by that point, the retailer is acclimated to what will sell in their store. So that's basically how you look at it. You could, by all means, continue to go down the path of, well, the numbers are meaningless because the only thing that matters is what goes home. But again, that's not a very compelling argument. Retailers are not over ordering, and besides, if you're gonna embrace that argument, then you also, if fair is fair, you've got to start to try and calculate how many of those copies that went home are done for speculation purposes. How many of those copies that went home actually were read and enjoyed versus just immediately put in a bag because they're completing a run? That's why all this stuff is a little bit more complicated than people give it credit for. At any rate, I hope this makes sense, clears some things up. I don't mean to make anybody upset. I know that there's some fairly large YouTubers who get really, really passionate about this. They continue to go down the line of, haha, this proves that comics aren't getting sold. I mean, okay, I don't think it does. It's certainly not like people think. But, you do you. Anyway, thanks for listening.